Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's session on what's ahead on Capitol Hill and transportation. My name is Ben Nasta. I'm NCSL's Legislative Director for our Transportation Standing Committee, as well as for our Natural Resources, Energy, and Environment Committee. Surface transportation legislation affects every state in the nation, governing everything from roads to trails, bike paths to rail programs, highway safety, hazardous materials, and much more. The last large-scale surface transportation reauthorization bill, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, passed in 2021 and is set to expire in FY 2026, paving the way for a new round of long-term legislation, discussions around which will begin in earnest in 2025. Now, as we all know, a lot can happen between now and then. A new presidential administration will be in the White House no matter what. The executive branch could change party control, as could the House and the Senate. But we're going to try our best to read the tea leaves and give a preview of transportation priorities at the state and federal levels and shake our magic 8-ball to try and get a read on what could be coming down the pipe. Today we're joined by some distinguished individuals who will be discussing two sides of the coin when it comes to surface transportation legislation, current and future, and how it will affect states moving forward. Jordan Baugh currently serves as Senior Policy Advisor for the majority staff of the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee. He's an experienced legislative policy advisor with a demonstrated history of working effectively in the halls of the Senate, and previously served as senior policy advisor for Senator Kirsten Gillibrand. We're also joined by Susan Howard, who serves as Director of Policy and Government Relations at the American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials, where she oversees the development and implementation of legislation, regulation, policy, and guidance. She also acts as the primary liaison to the organization's Committee on Funding and Finance and supports its Transportation Policy Forum. So now I'm going to pass it over to Jordan to get us started.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Ben, for that introduction and also for the invitation to join you today on this panel. It's a real pleasure to be here and to have an opportunity to talk about the highway bill, which is a part of what's known as the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. And I'm really glad to be joining Susan here as well, who I've had the pleasure of working with on a number of issues over the years, including implementation of this legislation. It's also great to be here with a group of state legislators and legislative staff. Although I work in Congress, I grew up close to Albany, New York, and going to the state capitol and frequent visits to see the Capitol really is part of what inspired me to want to work in public service. So it's a real great pleasure to be here. As Ben mentioned, I work for the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee. I am Senior Policy Advisor for Chairman Tom Carper. And just to kind of start, I'd like to tell you a little bit about what the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee does. It is one of 4 committees in the United States Senate that has jurisdiction over surface transportation. So the EPW committee, as we call it for short, oversees the federal highway program. So we have anything that has to do with roads, highways, and bridges. The Federal Highway Administration is handled through our committee. The Senate Banking Committee, which is one of our sister committees, handles public transit, so subways, buses, and the like. The Senate Commerce Committee, which is officially the Commerce, Science, and Transportation Committee, has jurisdiction over pretty much everything else in the transportation space, including aviation, ports, and all of that. And the Senate Finance Committee has the fun job of finding out how to pay for all of it. And so that's compared to the House of Representatives, where one committee, the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, handles pretty much all transportation policy. So it makes it a little bit more interesting in the Senate, with a lot more cooks in the kitchen when we're trying to put together a whole surface transportation reauthorization. So my job on the EPW committee staff as senior advisor for transportation and economic development is to advise the chairman on issues related to the implementation of our highway programs and oversight over the Federal Highway Administration. And I also have in my portfolio the Economic Development Administration and Federal Regional Commissions. In addition to advising the chairman and working with our committee members, a significant part of the role that I have is to draft legislation, including the legislation that's necessary to reauthorize our highway programs. When I joined Chairman Carper's staff about 3.5 years ago, the FAST Act had expired, And Congress was in the midst of kind of grappling how to reauthorize our highway programs. We'd been in a one-year extension. We were really trying to figure out if we could actually move forward. As you may recall, there were a lot of infrastructure weeks, a lot of talk of infrastructure week, but not a lot of action on enacting infrastructure legislation. And so that changed in 2021. Part of the reason that it changed is you had a bipartisan group of senators who met with President Biden, and sat down and mapped out a plan for how to enact infrastructure legislation by the summer. The result of that meeting was that we came back to Congress, redoubled our efforts, and started drafting a bipartisan bill. We're really fortunate in the EPW committee that in modern times, we really have a very bipartisan relationship, and we have worked on infrastructure legislation, water infrastructure, transportation infrastructure, economic development infrastructure in a very bipartisan way. And if you ever heard my boss, Chairman Tom Carper, speak, one of his very favorite phrases to say is that bipartisan solutions are lasting solutions. And that was the mantra that we took, every day when we were putting this legislation together. So we approached writing the highway bill by sitting down with colleagues on the Republican side of the aisle and the Democratic side of the aisle in the Senate to solicit their priorities. We had some differing priorities. On the Democratic side, we were very focused on addressing climate. We were very focused on improving bicycle and pedestrian safety. We were very focused on wanting to provide more funding for resilience of our infrastructure to address sea level rise and extreme weather. The Republican side of the aisle was very interested in maintaining the 90% of the highway program that flows through formulas directly to states, which I know Susan and Ashto are very thankful for, and also in maintaining the ability for state DOTs to continue to build more highway capacity. So we were successful in drafting a bill to do all of those things and much more. And the highway bill in our committee advanced by a unanimous vote, 20-0, with Bernie Sanders on the left and Jim Inhofe on the right, all voting for it. What we didn't know at the time is that that highway bill would become a part of something even much larger, which was the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, known as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. As we know, we ended up with the largest federal investment in surface transportation in our nation's history, $1.2 trillion over 5 years. And we were able to do that because of that shared leadership and that bipartisan commitment. And I think that is what it's going to take going forward to move infrastructure legislation. As been alluded to, it's already been 3 years into a 5-year bill, and our highway programs will need to be reauthorized over the next 2 years. They'll expire at the end of fiscal year 2026. And before that happens, I think that there are some important decisions that are going to need to be made by whomever the incoming chairs and ranking members of the House and Senate committees are. Some of that hinges on the election and which party will control Congress, which party will control the White House, whether we'll be in a divided government, because as you all know, as legislators, whomever holds the gavel sets the agenda. And so we can't really predict what the major focus and priorities will be until later this year and into early next year. And also, for example, my boss, Senator Carper, is retiring, and we'll have a new chairman on leading the Democrats on the EPW committee, who will also come with his or her own set of priorities. But I think regardless of who controls which chamber of commerce or Congress, or who is the president of the United States, I think that there are some real issues that are going to be front and center. The first issue is, what is the scope of the next bill going to be? As you may recall, that in addition to the approximately $303 billion in funding through the Highway Trust Fund for our programs, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law also appropriated nearly $50 billion on top of that for additional highway programs. And beyond highways, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law also included billions of dollars for drinking water, wastewater infrastructure, ports and waterways, airports, and passenger and freight rail. So the big question is, will Congress go back to a more traditional highway bill like we had with the FAST Act or MAP 21 or any of those precursor bills? Or will Congress want to look beyond just the Highway Trust Fund and highway programs and continue some of the other programs like the NEVI program for electric vehicle charging infrastructure, the airport terminal program, the bridge investment program, which is working to rebuild the Brent Spence Bridge, which isn't too far from where we are here today. And we don't know the answer to that yet. That's, I think, going to be the fundamental question that needs to be answered first. And I think certainly hearing from states and stakeholders throughout that process is going to be very important as members of Congress start to think about what is the appetite for the type of bill that we want and what is the type of bill that states really need going forward in order to continue to build upon the successes that we're seeing so far from the bipartisan infrastructure bill. So once we figure out the scope of what the bill is going to be, then I think that we're also going to need to think about some policy changes that we may need in the next bill regardless. There's a saying that, everything we do, we can do better. And so the committees want to look at what was working well with the bipartisan infrastructure law and how we can work to make it even better. I think that one area that will get a lot of interest and scrutiny is around the discretionary grant programs. As you may know, we created a number of new discretionary grant programs, many of which have been very popular, and some of which have had difficulties, admittedly, with their rollout and with implementation. However, we did something different when we created these new programs as well. We opened up grant opportunities more to local governments and to metropolitan planning organizations that have not always had the ability to directly apply for federal transportation dollars. So that's created opportunities, but also a lot of challenges, particularly for smaller cities that don't necessarily have a large transportation or public works department and may not have experience with applying for, or just as importantly, administering large, complex federal grant programs. So, one of the things that Congress may want to look at is there more that we can provide in terms of technical assistance and support for local communities to help improve capacity building and project delivery so that they can be successful with the programs that they want to carry out. Because many of these projects are really important safety and quality of life projects, like constructing a new sidewalk or building a safe bicycle and pedestrian path. And we want to really make sure that we can help communities continue to do those things. Another priority that I expect we'll see is safety, particularly around work zones. We've seen some really truly horrible incidents where transportation, highway construction workers have been struck and killed in work zones. And so I think this is a really important issue, certainly for the road builders and their industry, but also for others who really care about safety in our highway rights of way. Bridges have obviously been in the news a lot lately, and we should expect that there will be an effort to continue to provide robust amounts of funding for bridge replacement and rehabilitation projects. The bridge investment program that I mentioned has been a really extremely popular program because we have so many bridges in our country that are just so expensive to replace or rehabilitate, and the formula program just isn't going to provide the amount of funding that many states and localities need to do those really big, massive projects. So I think that is something that will certainly be part of the conversation. And along with that, Congress will probably want to look at what more can be done to protect bridges from the type of collision that we tragically saw in Baltimore that brought down the Francis Scott Key Bridge. So that should be part of that conversation as well. I also think that policies around newer technologies like electric vehicles, like autonomous vehicles, will be part of that conversation. Certainly, there's been a lot of conversation around the NEVI program and the implementation of the program that provides funding for putting EV chargers in the ground and to create a national network of EV chargers around the country. That's certainly something that will be, I'm sure, part of the conversation, as well as how we safely integrate autonomous vehicles into our highway system, making sure that should autonomous vehicles be deployed more broadly, we want to make sure that our roads and our signs and pavement markings and everything are ready to be compatible with those types of vehicles in order to protect safety. And then finally, there's obviously the perennial question of how are we going to pay for all of this. There are a number of different ideas out there, but what's very clear is that the status quo is really not sustainable for the Highway Trust Fund over time. And I think that actually states are much further ahead than the federal government in this regard, because many states are carrying out pilot programs for alternative funding sources. And I think that those pilot programs that are being carried out on a state and regional level are going to be really instructive to the federal government when we start to think about what may or may not work and what's the best way of looking at options outside of the gas tax for raising revenues for the Highway Trust Fund. And so there's still a lot of work to do, but I think that over time, hopefully we'll be able to find a solution that will be lasting and that will actually create solvency and sustainability in the Highway Trust Fund. And that all being said, it's really a very exciting time to be working on transportation policy on Capitol Hill. We've had an incredibly productive few years. And as you know, the work of legislating is never done, and there's always more to do, and we'll be gearing up, in the next year for the next reauthorization. It's often said that our highway programs are federally funded and state administered, and so that close partnership between the federal government and states is really crucial to the success of the bipartisan infrastructure law and what comes next. And actually, hopefully that provides a good transition for what Susan is going to talk about from the perspective of state departments of transportation. And so again, I really appreciate the opportunity to be here and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Jordan. And Susan, we'll turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, and thanks for the invitation to be here and the opportunity to speak to you all about surface transportation reauthorization. My name is Susan Howard. I work for AASHTO. We are the national organization that represents the 52, yes, I said 52, state DOTs. We do count DC and Puerto Rico among our members. And we really work at the federal level, to bring the state DOT perspective to, at least in my realm, policy and legislation. Pretty much any function of a state DOT is mirrored within AASHTO's own committee structure, similar to NCSL. We have a really robust committee structure so that we're bringing together experts from all the states to talk about right-of-way, to talk about maintenance, to talk about funding and finance, to talk about multimodal transportation. So we do have a really broad scope. We are about 100 years old, and we are a multimodal focused agency, not just the old highway association that people, I think, sometimes still associate us with. So I'm really happy to be able to have a chance to talk to you about reauthorization of the Surface Transportation Program. Obviously, this is a huge priority for AASHTO. In fact, we have already started our process. We started back in February. We began by launching a set of 8 topical white papers that we're developing that are designed to be kind of broad and cross-cutting on subjects like resilience, electric vehicles, workforce and equity, funding, finance, and program structure, planning, performance-based management, safety, operations, a whole lot of different issue areas, and we'll then go into more modal-specific recommendations after this first phase is over. But our goal is to have our recommendations ready a year before the bill expires, so by September 30th of 2025, we'll have a very robust package of recommendations that we can talk to the administration about and talk to our partners on Capitol Hill about. A lot of this will be sort of looking at what worked and didn't work with the IIJA, but some of the fundamental questions, I think Jordan did an excellent job laying out some of the questions and concerns that Congress will have to reckon with as they look to sort of what's next after the IIJA. We've been really focused on implementation because, as Jordan mentioned, we do have a federally funded state administered program, and each of our states work with their local governments, their counties, and their other municipalities to deliver projects. So we've been really focused on delivering the promise of the IIJA, making sure the dollars are put to good use. And I feel confident that we have done a good role in that. I think if you look at the formula dollars that have come out through the IIJA, our obligation rate is extremely high, probably around 95%. So we strongly believe that the formula dollars are the way to get the program executed in the best way possible, but obviously we talk about discretionary grants too, because that was a huge focus of the IIJA, as was mentioned. Each surface transportation bill, I feel like, sort of has a theme, and probably the theme of the IIJA was just like bigger, better, bolder, everything. It's not just a surface transportation bill, even though that is the core of it. I mean, I think that was the impetus driving the IIJA, was that we had the FAST Act expiring. And federal transportation bills have to be either extended or renewed, because we rely on the federal gas tax to fund the Highway Trust Fund, and that's something that can't lapse. If it lapses, the money stops flowing. So it is a good driver to have sort of a emergency date, so to speak, of when our current reauthorization will expire and we have to do something. So the core of the bill, this 5-year reauthorization of surface transportation programs, plus a whole lot more. So it's a reauthorization bill plus. Mm-hmm. Lots of different types of funding streams that were new or innovative. Lots of focus on other infrastructure, like was mentioned, broadband, energy, water and wastewater, a whole new sort of, again, these programs had been funded perhaps in the past at the federal level, but not with this scope and size, and not with this sort of like, we're going to do this for 5 years. So that really was, I think, a bit of a sea change. I think that really remains to be seen if the next bill will be a capital I infrastructure bill or a surface transportation reauthorization bill. You probably would get different answers across the spectrum from folks on that, and I think we don't quite know yet what that focus will be. Obviously, because we're AASHTO, our focus is on the surface transportation side of things. So again, as we're working to develop our priorities, we're looking across the IIJA and looking at what worked for our state DOT members and what perhaps didn't work as well, and where we want to offer some suggestions. The themes, that Jordan laid out are absolutely top of mind. I mean, this was a bill that had a big focus on resilience, on carbon reduction, on safety, on equity, a lot of newer areas for transportation. Not necessarily newer, we had worked in these spaces, but I think having dedicated formula dollars for something like carbon reduction, and having a real drive kind of infused in many of the discretionary grant programs. So that's been a bit of a sea change. And I guess another big theme that came out of IIJA was that focus on, emerging areas or different areas, or kind of like focus on what we want the transportation program to be and what it can deliver in terms of bigger goals. And we certainly embrace those as we, support a multimodal transportation network that can support all users of our system. I think that's where I'll stop for now. But again, appreciate the opportunity to talk with you all and look forward to your questions.
Thank you both so much. What we're going to do now is we're going to open it up for questions from the audience. If you see we have a standing mic here in the middle, please feel free to walk up and ask questions. I'm happy to kick us off. I have some written down, but I see that we have a question here.
Is this on? It's on? Thanks. I'm Representative Kay Christopherson from Utah. Just wanted to ask you about the role of government. What is the role of the federal government, the role of the state governments? And as I look at the money that is going through the federal government, originally the federal government was lined up to do interstate system. That's pretty much done. And now we've continued with program after program. And what I've seen in our state is that when the federal government gets involved, it's a lot more strings attached, a lot more expensive, a lot more regulations. And we sometimes just say, we'll just do it ourselves. It's just a lot simpler and cheaper and faster. So I'm just saying, is it time to reevaluate our transportation's program and say, is it time to just turn it back over to the states? Take the funding that the federal gas tax, let the states keep that and do their own programs. Can't we just go that direction? What do you think on that?
Okay. Thanks for that question. Yeah, absolutely. The concept that you're talking about is one that we do, just come up fairly often, and we call it devolution, meaning you would do away with a federal trust fund and federal program and simply have the revenue generated by the gas tax in the state go back to the state. And so it has been floated over time. I'm not sure if it's gotten a lot of legs congressionally, but usually there are a few members who champion that idea. I think generally the reason to support a federal program is that these projects don't necessarily stop at state borders. There are national priorities and national needs that are best met that way. But I totally understand what you're saying in the sense that, you know, when we established the Highway Trust Fund back in 1956, it had a clear purpose, which was to build the interstate system. It has evolved over time to include a lot of different programs and supports. Again, you know, all of our states have their own funding mechanisms, of which many of you are aware, whether it's state gas tax, vehicle registration fees, road usage charges, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Very few projects are, if any, are 100% federal money, so it's a combination of, you know, the federal piece, the state piece, and sometimes even the local piece. But you're right, with federal dollars comes strings or comes requirements. I think that's been one of the big challenges with the discretionary grant programs. As you open up to a whole new universe of recipients, understanding what it means to comply with NEPA, Davis-Bacon, et cetera, et cetera. So we have a federal system, and it has, I guess maybe, I don't know if fractured is too strong of a word. It's bended and shifted based on where we are as a country. I still think there's value in it, but that's certainly an argument that we do hear from time to time.
Well, I agree with what Susan said, and I think, you know, certainly our federal transportation programs have been able to do some of the things that states might not be able to do on their own in terms of building the interstate highway system, providing funding for really large mega projects, because these projects still need to be carried out. And so I think that, you know, certainly, you know, like we said, the program is federally funded and state administered. States, on the highway side, states own a lot of the highway assets. They're, you know, responsible for maintenance of those projects, but when it comes to capital projects, you know, the federal government does provide funding to carry those out. And so I think that there's certainly, you know, federalism at work in how our highway program is administered currently.
Good afternoon. Dewan Johnson, Staff Attorney, Mississippi House. Given the incidents around the Francis Scott Key Bridge incident, are there any conversations being held in Congress as relates to minimum thresholds on liability insurances for those maritime vessels that have caused those type of those encounters?
Not in Congress, certainly not in our committee. That wouldn't be something that our committee would handle. I think that the insurance liability issues would probably be more of a state regulatory issue, but I'm not aware of any particular legislative proposals in Congress or discussions that pertain specifically to that. But certainly, you know, the insurance aspect of that incident is going to be a major factor. And in fact, you know, the state of Maryland is using federal emergency relief funding. Intends to use federal emergency relief program funding to rebuild that bridge. Part of which, because part of the reason is because under the regulations, any money that comes back to the state through an insurance claim actually goes to then replenish the federal program. So in a way, it's a way to get the responsible party to pay, maybe not up front because the process takes a long time, but we'll end up paying for a significant cost of rebuilding that bridge. Yeah.
That was ironic that we moved on to that. Delegate Jared Solomon from the state of Maryland, and I serve on the subcommittee of our appropriations committee that deals with transportation.
You might be able to answer that question.
Yeah.
I don't represent Baltimore, but former Baltimore City resident, and that is a huge need. And actually, I just wanted to say thank you. I mean, our state has benefited tremendously from the infrastructure bill of the metro system and the MARC rail system that runs through the heart of my district, as well as a new light rail that we're building, and we have seen just generational items that have been on the books forever in planning that we've been able to get money for to advance things that will not just help Maryland, but the entire capital region. So I just wanted to say thank you for that. The one question I have, I guess, is for you, Jordan, and I don't know that you can directly answer this, but just sort of as an issue that I think I was really disappointed that I think we all kind of dropped the ball on from the administration on down with the Affordable Connectivity Program. That was just so historic. Maybe it's more the Commerce Committee, but is there any talk about restarting that? I mean, like 25 million families that were able to get internet access for that. You talked about broadband, but obviously that's sort of that last connectivity piece. Any ideas or thoughts on how that's going to
honestly, that's a program that's in the Commerce Committee's jurisdiction. It's not something that I've really worked specifically with. So I don't really have, unfortunately, anything that any kind of insight or anything on that program. But certainly be happy to connect afterwards and see if I could connect you with my colleagues who.
Thank you, and again, thank you for your work. It's meant quite a bit to our state, and we appreciate you continuing to work on the bridge issue.
Great.
Hi, thanks. Phil Pouch, Vermont representative. I'll say thanks for the infrastructure bill too. It's done a lot. It's opened up a lot of things for us. And the resiliency parts of it are critical for our state. We've had some towns that have had over a week 2 100-year storms. So we'd be looking more for support on that. My question is the gas tax, federal gas tax. I know Vermont, the gas tax is insufficient to support our roads and matching funds that we need. We're looking at different opportunities there, we're stealing from the general fund to support transportation. I'm wondering what is, on the horizon, and is there any actual action we can expect from Washington with the, TAX attached to it? So thanks.
Well, certainly that's, So I will say, in the bipartisan infrastructure law, we established a federal funding alternatives advisory board and a vehicle miles traveled pilot program. And so as part of the implementation of the bipartisan infrastructure law, that advisory board is being stood up to look at what states are doing, what regions are doing in terms of vehicle miles traveled or different ways of collecting revenue for the highway trust fund that would be different from the gas tax, because I think we all acknowledge that the gas tax is just not a sustainable funding source. It was never indexed to inflation. Certainly as vehicles become more efficient and more EVs are on the road, the revenues aren't coming in for vehicles that are not filling up a tank of gas the same way that cars historically have. And so I think that advisory board and that pilot program are really tasked with coming up with ideas that Congress can then use in drafting the new bill, whether it's this next infrastructure bill or whether it's going to take time and be the next infrastructure bill or highway bill, still yet to be seen. But I think, certainly my boss, Chairman Carper, has talked about this. The chairman, Sam Graves of the House T&I Committee has talked about this a lot. I think there's a growing bipartisan acknowledgement in Congress that something needs to be done. Certainly, obviously, dealing with revenues is always tricky and difficult. But I think that there's going to come a time where kind of the rubber meets the road, so to speak, and we're going to really need to do something on this.
Yeah, I would just add, I think for what became the IIJA, AASHTO had like 5 or 6 top priorities, and we could say pretty definitively that we made progress on all of them except for the biggest one, which was sustainable funding. So it's sort of same song, different verse. Not to paint too dire of a picture, but to keep the IIJA funding levels in another, like that current level in a new 5-year bill, we're going to need $143 billion in additional highway trust fund revenue. And if we want to continue the general fund advance appropriations, again, not to get too wonky on you, but there's another category of funding which is essentially guaranteed funding, because it's not subject to the appropriations process, that will require $195 billion to keep that funding level. So the conversation about what size of a bill very quickly turns to how to pay for it. And, the options are kind of what the options have been. You either raise the current fees and revenue that comes into the trust fund, you find something else, or you right size. And that would mean a dramatic cut to the program, which no one wants to see. So For many years, AASHTO has put out a document we call the funding matrix, which shows many, 30, 40 options for revenue that could support the Highway Trust Fund. Don't laugh at them all. Some of them are wild, like a bicycle tire tax, but it's more to be illustrative that there are options out there. You can tie a user fee to a lot of different revenue sources. We just have not gotten there with Congress and with enacting legislation.
Hi, I'm Sam Balto. I'm an educator in Portland, Oregon, and I lead the organized bike ride to school called a Bike Bus, and our rides have inspired more of these efforts to increase physical activity and joy for children to school. I'd be curious what in this package and everything prioritizes children's mobility. Children are 20% of the population, but 100% of our future. Thank you.
Well, thanks for that question. I think it's a really important issue. I have 8-year-old twins myself who walk to school, and having the ability for children to safely get where they need to go is really critical. As part of the bipartisan infrastructure law, we significantly increased what's known as transportation alternatives. I think $7.2 billion in the bill was for that program. Part of that program is the Safe Routes to School program, which focuses on ensuring that there is funding available to provide adequate, safe sidewalks, trails, ways for kids to be able to get to school safely. And that's an incredibly popular program and something that has been really successful across the country. And so there is funding in the bill for that. We've also provided additional funding to incentivize states to improve their infrastructure as it relates to just bicyclists and pedestrians broadly, because we have just seen such alarming statistics about the bicycle and pedestrian fatalities and injuries that have occurred on our road. And so hopefully that answers your question. I don't know if Susan has anything else she wants to add.
I was just going to mention the Safe Streets for All grant program, which is very localized. I mean, state DOTs are not even eligible for the funding. It's designed to really look at the most vulnerable local intersections and roads where you have, pedestrian fatalities and injuries or bicycle injuries at a high rate. So I think that part of this is like looking down to like where you can move the needle and make improvements, and empowering local governments to have some say in that and planning for those types of projects, which hopefully they can use state and federal resources for construction. And then the other thing I would just mention is that, the safety crisis is a lot of different things kind of coming into it. I think we're trying to look at it across all of the modes. It's a technology problem, it's also a design problem, it's also a funding problem, it's also, so how can we leverage sort of all the resources that we have to identify the right countermeasures and put them into practice?
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Vitan. I'm from Illinois. I'm Chief of Staff for a state senator. One of the biggest issues we're facing in Illinois right now is our funding cliff with public transit. So I'm wondering if you can speak to what opportunities or potential opportunities are coming down the chute as far as like funding for public transit and just rail in general.
Certainly. Well, that's a real issue that we're hearing, across the country. I think certainly with after COVID, we've seen a real decrease that hasn't really gotten where it was pre-COVID in terms of ridership, and a lot of our transit programs are funded, as you know, through fares and by the riders. You pay for what you use, and so there are a couple of things that have gotten some focus. One of which is to provide additional flexibility to allow transit agencies to use federal funding for operating costs to try to address that issue, because traditionally, the federal government provides funding for the capital programs, and then revenues and local funding is used for operating. Because revenues are so down, a lot of transit agencies have asked for that flexibility, and so that's one thing that's being looked at. There certainly are a lot of funding opportunities through the bipartisan infrastructure law for transit, for rail. We provided $66 billion for passenger and freight rail in the bipartisan infrastructure law. So there are both formula and grant opportunities that localities can take advantage of for those projects. But I think certainly, until ridership numbers get back to where they were pre-pandemic, this is certainly going to be a challenge that we're going to continue to face. But hopefully, through some of the multimodal grant programs, through additional flexibilities, states will be able to kind of get a little bit of more assistance in the meantime for those projects. And certainly, by having more capital, funding available as well, that allows localities to use more of their money for operating. So it kind of goes both ways.
Yeah, I would only add that I do think that the operating expenses question is going to be one that Congress will have to face in the reauthorization. I think the tide has turned enough on the sort of crisis that transit agencies are facing that if it's kind of been an idea that's been sidelined in the past, I think it's going to be more front and center this time.
Yes, I'm Representative Jake Fye from the state of Washington, and I'd like to hear your views a bit on formula versus projects that get funded nationally, and particularly with respect to all the effort that jurisdictions, whether it's local governments or state governments, go through to prepare an application only to have it not funded. A lot of resources, engineering expertise goes towards that, and then in lots of cases, if I've looked at the numbers right, a lot of that effort doesn't result in a project at the state or local level. Now, big projects, you can understand that if it's a bridge. We like bridges between two states in my neck of the woods, but there seems to be not a rhyme or reason, and maybe it's because, like any other elected official, congressional people like to cut ribbons and like to have the project funded and get credit for it. But there's a lot of waste that occurs in all that effort to put an application together. Maybe there's some ways in which you could put people into a queue so that they could be assured that if they applied, that it might not happen this year, but it might happen 5 years from now. But there seems to be a lot of wasted effort of quality engineering and other expertise in putting to get these applications together that don't get any results from it.
Yeah, sure, I'll start. Yeah, absolutely. Great question. I think that we have seen a lot of challenges with the discretionary grant process. ASHA put together some recommendations on some ways that we think things could be improved. A lot of our state DOTs are working hand in hand directly with local recipients, almost like from the incubator stage of like, if you have a project that you're thinking could be a good discretionary grant, come sit down with us, let's talk about it, let's work on it together, because then if you get the grant, we could probably even help you administer it, taking away some of that challenge when it comes to administering federal dollars. So, but our folks are strapped thin too, and our folks are even balancing within the state DOTs, like, is it worth going for this discretionary grant, or do we just kind of rely on formula to get it done over time? It's extremely competitive. Doing something like a benefit cost analysis is very difficult and tricky, I think, for a lot of entities. So I think one thing that Congress is going to have to look at is the number of programs, and I don't want to say rate of return, but like how successful have we been in obligating dollars and outlaying dollars? I mean, obligating meaning we got an agreement, outlaying meaning the money is out in the, out there in the economy. Grants are typically much slower to obligate than formula dollars, but there's a reason for that. I mean, it's a competitive process. It's involving decision-making at the federal level. I kind of wonder if, I don't know if I'm going to say this word out loud. Are these discretionary grant programs satisfying an itch that earmarks? We didn't have earmarks in the IIJA, but we have a lot of programs to direct dollars to local priorities. So I don't know if earmarks will ever come back. I don't think my association would even support that necessarily, but or we would with some guardrails perhaps. But I think that there's just a big universe out there with the expanded number of programs and the expanded recipients. And you want to give credit to USDOT because I do think they have done an excellent job in trying to identify the areas where technical assistance is needed and providing that. It's just a big ocean and a lot of little fish. I don't mean that to be insulting.
Yeah, no, I think that I think that all is right, and it's interesting that you mentioned earmarks because they have come back in the appropriations bills, but you will see, if you look back through history, when Congress stopped providing earmarks in the transportation bill, that is when we started to see more of a proliferation of discretionary grant programs because it allowed for programs that directed funds to certain policy ends and policy goals. Formula funding, we provide the formulas, but once that funding goes to the states, that money is for the states. And so, discretionary grants do kind of preserve some of that ability for the administration and for Congress to also kind of direct where some of these priorities are, where some federal funding can go. I think looking at streamlining the grant process is going to be something that we're going to have to look at in the next reauthorization. I think that your point on the amount of effort that goes into these applications, particularly small communities, smaller cities, there is a lot that goes into it, and to not get that return that you're looking for, I'm sure can be really frustrating. That's certainly the case, though, with any discretionary grant program. But I think, whether it's looking at combining grant programs, because we have, kind of more siloed grant programs right now. We've got, freight-related grant programs. We've got, resilience programs. We've got, the Reconnecting Communities program, which is dealing with taking down some highway infrastructure that people don't want in their cities anymore. And so, maybe looking at, are there larger buckets that you could kind of combine some of these into that might make it easier, right? Because you're not applying for 15 different grants, but also give a little bit more flexibility, in terms of grant size, in terms of, recipient size, so that you're making the process as easy as possible for local government. It's not going to be easy because the federal aid highway program is complicated, but I think making it easier and more, maybe a little bit more predictable and a little bit more user-friendly for folks that don't have a lot of experience working with federal, directly with USDOT, is something that Congress may want to look at.
Can I add just one thing
Yeah.
too? I just wanted to mention on the funding side, I think one of the challenges with discretionary grants is you might have a $5 million, that's really low. Let's say $5 million anyway. You have a $5 million project and you get 200,000. Like, what do you do? Where do you go for the extra? Where do you go for the match? Because these all require a match too, or state or local share. So I think that's a bump in the road that we've seen. And I think that has a lot to do, I think, with just knowing when the right time to apply is and what the right program is. And that's where I think the technical assistance that's provided by USDOT and some of our state DOTs as well can be very helpful, because it is a question of time and opportunity. And like you said, it's frustrating if you've gone through the process once to have no guarantee that you're anywhere close to the top of the queue second round. It's all a clean slate. So I think some other things that could be beneficial that I've heard of are sort of, if for bigger projects, could you do like a year 1, year 2, year 3, and once the first milestone is met, then you don't have to reapply again. It's kind of a phased approach for some of these projects too, for discretionary grants.
Hi, I'm Shannon Francis, state representative from Kansas. And one of the complaints I get from my constituents more than anything is blocked railroad crossings. And another complaint I get from my Department of Transportation is how difficult the railroads are to work with. So we come up with all of these things like limiting train length and personnel on the train, which are often were stopped because of federal preemption. So I guess one of my things is there anything in the next transportation bill that could happen to help us with those issues? And do you think there may be an increase, or the best way to increase funding for railroad crossing eliminations and grade separations?
Well, Senator, thank you very much for that question. I think so. There is funding in the bipartisan infrastructure law for grade crossing elimination. I think this is certainly a timely topic. I think I read something in the paper perhaps last week. The administration took some action with regard to Norfolk Southern and the challenges that Amtrak has dealing with Norfolk Southern, and also blocked crossings came up as part of that. I think that's, there's certainly, the grade crossing separation issue, and there is funding for that. I think in terms of, blocked railroad crossings, there's also an enforcement element there that, we'll need to look at how, are the freight railroads complying with what they need to do as well to limit those challenges. But I don't know, Susan, if you have anything on that as well. Yeah.
Could I
will say rail is a little bit out of my exact wheelhouse, so yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
one of the frustrations my community had also, just to respond to your first comment,
Yeah.
is my understanding was the current program was supposed to kind of let every year.
I'm sorry?
The current grade elimination program was supposed to happen every year. It just led again, and it had been more than a year and a half.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's a frustration
Yeah,
on our
totally.
part. So,
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Oh, no problem at all. Yeah, the grade crossing elimination at those highway and rail intersections has been a big priority for the state DOTs for a long time. And actually, it's one area where the class ones usually want to work with us because it's federal money that they can use to eliminate a problem for them as well. It's kind of a win-win for everyone. But yeah, I understand the frustration over the cycle, not being on a steady cycle. And I think that in part may have to do with just the absolute deluge of funding resources that came to railroad and passenger and freight railroad programs within the IIJA. But yes, that's definitely Section 130 is the title of Title 23, Section 1 of Title 23 that deals with this program. We've seen this a lot too on things like flaggers and like DOT having to coordinate with the railroad and it taking a really long time and all that. So we're definitely looking for efficiencies. It's been one of the priorities of our leadership this year, and I hope we can keep working on it in the next bill.
I will take moderator's preference and ask a question here. For both of you, my question is, given the programmatic nature of IIJA, what are some programs that you think could be were successful in IIJA, and could they be carried over into the next round of infrastructure funding?
In terms of specific projects or programs, I mean, I think that, what we were talking about in terms of the discretionary grant programs, I think they all are successful in what they are trying to achieve. I think the question is going to be, what form do we have them going into the next reauthorization bill? And so I think, the real question is going to be, are we going to maintain, a bunch of separate grant programs, or are we going to look at combining kind of larger grant programs? The administration has already kind of started along this path a little bit with the combined notice of funding opportunity for some of the larger programs for, infra and rural and mega, so that, applicants didn't have to, submit 3 different applications for those programs. You could submit one application and it could be considered for any of those programs. So, maybe looking at building upon that to make it even easier for recipients, I think is probably what we're going to look at.
A couple that I would just highlight, I think that I can't guarantee what form they're going to take or if they will continue, but I think they'll get a lot of attention. And one is the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program. And the second is this bill created 2 new formula programs. I don't want to make it sound like it's not like it's a big deal. All right, fine. It's a big deal to establish a new formula program. So I'll be curious to see how those are met, if there are tweaks to them, if there's a desire to do more through formula. So we used to have dozens and dozens and dozens of very specific formula programs, and then MAP 21 streamlined, made the program eligibilities a lot broader, more flexible, and I think that was, universally agreed to be a good step. But there is also the tendency to, if there's something that's a priority, create a formula program for it when it might already be an eligibility that exists elsewhere. You just have to sort of amplify and clarify the transferability and eligibility. So that's another one I'll be looking at in terms of this kind of core formula program.
Well, thank you both, and I think we have time for one more question.
Thank you. Hello, I'm Rebecca White. I'm one of the state senators from Vermont. We have discussed in our House and Senate transportation the need for unique materials to build out roads. In particular, as Representative Pouch noted, we have lots of flooding. Impervious surfaces are a major issue for us when it comes to flooding. Are there any funds or supports from the federal government to explore creative technology outside of just our traditional asphalt, concrete, just kind of repeating the same types of surface material use that we have traditionally been using?
Well, I'll just say, this is one of the issues that came up when we were drafting the bipartisan infrastructure law. There was an interest in creating a program. I think it was based on legislation that Senator Whitehouse from Rhode Island and Senator Collins from Maine have worked on. We weren't able to get support, enough support to include that in the bill. But I think that there is interest in, I think that in the next bill, that's something that we're going to continue to see interest in, looking at ways to incentivize research around alternative materials. We did, in the Inflation Reduction Act, include a program that incentivizes state DOTs to start using lower embodied carbon materials, which we worked really closely with the industry stakeholders on. But I think in terms of more addressing kind of the impervious pavements and materials like that, I think that there's a lot more that needs to be done, and I think that certainly that's something in the next bill that we may address. We just weren't able to specifically address it in the bipartisan infrastructure law.
I'm not a materials engineer, but this is something I could talk about for a while because ASHA is really into materials.
Yeah.
One thing I mentioned is the IIJA established a new advanced research program called ARPA-I. It's based on, I believe, a defense program called ARPA. I can't recall what ARPA stands for. But it's ARPA-I, so ARPA for infrastructure. And one of the key areas that they sent out, they put out a request for information, tell us what we should be researching. And one of the top priorities for ASHTOs was this topic in and of itself. State DOTs are, I don't want to say we're extremely risk averse, but when it comes to the materials that we're using, safety, how has it been tested, it has to be heavily researched. So we need a pipeline for looking at these newer types of materials. Jordan is right. Most of the conversation recently has been around low carbon materials. And then just to plug for ASHTO, we have a program called Product Evaluation and Audit, which looks at a lot of this stuff as well. So within our engineering side of things, there's a lot of focus and attention on this. So I do think it's a real emerging area, and I'm hopeful that some of the resources that have been put into that ARPA-I initiative will be able to fund some heavy-duty research that we need at the federal level when it comes to transportation materials and the universe out there that we have not really been able to fully scratch the surface on. No pun intended.
Well, thank you both so much for joining us. Please join me in giving our presenters a round of applause. I want to thank everybody for joining us today. Before you go, I do want to put a plug in for the last session in our transportation track, which is Shifting Gears, Accelerating Progress for Safer Roads, happening tomorrow from 1:30 to 2:45 p.m. In M108-111. So please join our great Denver-based transportation staff for that one. It's supposed to be a great session. Thank you. Thank you guys so much.